So our next guest has compiled results from over 633 unique sources related to IoT malware families. Based on that, he created an analysis framework that led to numerous valuable case studies. Andrei Costin, assistant professor and independent security researcher at firmware.re, is joining us on stage to share all his experience and his knowledge from all this research.
Thank you for being here. My name is Andrei Costin. Welcome to my talk. But before we begin, maybe we give a hand of applause to everybody doing DefCamp because it was long 2 days, but really nice one. Thank you, everybody, especially this kind of technical problems. Thanks. So today's talk, it's about IoT malware. It's a comprehensive survey analysis framework and case studies. And basically, this talk is not about going into the bits and bytes of malware or reversing. It's a more high-level talk. So if you're expecting to go into bits and bytes of IoT malware analysis, it's not that kind of a talk. But who am I? I'm assistant professor at University of Jyväskylä in Finland, somewhere in the middle of Finland. I mainly do research and teaching on IoT and embedded and security, system security. And occasionally I try to run the firmware.re project, and you can reach me at these addresses. And my co-author at this, for this work is Jonas Zadah. He's a malware researcher at Talos Group, part of Cisco, and he's working on IoT malware analysis and analysis automation. So this is basically the agenda we propose for today. Well, I think today's setup doesn't like me, maybe because it's the last presentation and I'm between you and the prizes, but. So we'll just go into an introduction of the topic a bit, and then we'll take a look a bit on the challenges of IoT malware analysis. We'll go through malware study, the methodology, metadata, and survey we did. We'll showcase some case studies, and then we'll conclude this talk, and I'll be open for Q&A. Well, very short introduction for IoT malware and PC malware. So the question is, well, why IoT malware and so on? But everybody knows what IoT is, right? So there's no need to go and explain everything from the beginning what IoT means. But essentially, well, it's just a paradigm connecting all kinds of embedded devices one way or another through the internet with each other. And basically, everything which can be an embedded device is theoretically part of the new IoT wave. So it includes printers, routers, smart TVs, CCTV cameras, your light bulbs, well, cars, maybe, and many other things. So it's basically useless to enumerate everything. But the idea is that all of them are embedded computers. They run some code, and of course they have vulnerabilities and stuff like that. So they are also a good target for IoT malware, not just our computers or laptops or servers. Why is IoT or an embedded device a target for IoT malware? Well, the IoT devices or the embedded devices are generally always on, or are intended to be always on, so they're always connected, ready to do some computation for IoT malware. Because of the IoT paradigm, they're most likely always connected one way or another. However, at the same time, the awareness and defenses against IoT malware is much lower than for the PC malware because, well, people understand through the decades of trials and errors, they understand the PC malware. But with the embedded devices, it's a bit harder to understand how does that IoT malware functions and how you get infected and how you clean this up. And anyway, there's a lot of technological issues underlying and underpinning these problems, like how do you install an antivirus for IoT malware? Where do you run it? Do you run it on the device? How do you see the device? Keyboard, monitor, stuff like that. So there's a whole bunch of technological problems which basically underpins or emphasizes the lower awareness and some limitations to deal with IoT malware. At the same time, IoT malware is doing pretty fine because the exploits needed to exploit the embedded devices are not so sophisticated compared to modern normal malware attacks for computer servers and so on. So the level of sophistication is magnitude lower. So that's basically the easy target. At the same time, of course, is not something specific to IoT malware, but the source code for some IoT malwares has been released, is very successfully being derived, extended, improved, and so on. So that also gives a bit of a head start for IoT malware developers. And, well, that's the last point in this list, but it's not the least point. Basically, the build automation is offsetting the pain of developing for several platforms. So before, to develop an IoT malware, one had to know a lot of embedded programming. Like, you need to know cross-tool chains, cross-compilers, build them first, then get the malware, source code, build it. Now, there's an explosion of, because of the IoT is catching up, there's a lot of environments which provide you good environments to just compile everything for ARM, MIPS, PowerPC, and so on. And examples include Buildroot and cross-tool ng and projects like that, which basically you don't need to be so skilled in embedded programming anymore to be able to just compile the malware for a new platform. So these are just some of the lists, and that's basically a no-brainer choice for any IoT malware author. But then, of course, if we look from the defender point of view, and by the way, how many of you are working for antivirus or threat intelligence companies or have dealt with malware analysis? Well, just one person, 2 persons. Oh, unexpected. Okay, some more. Okay, undercover. Got it. But the idea is that there are things about IoT malware which makes it a bit different, at least from at this point in time. Maybe in future it will change, but at this point in time, there are things in IoT malware which are making it a bit different to analyze in some way. So if we talk about the PC, so platform heterogeneity in the PC world or traditional computing is basically low, is x86, x86, 64 bits. Once you learn that assembly or reversing and building a bunch of tools for that, then it's pretty easy and straightforward to do the analysis. At the same time, for IoT, the platform heterogeneity is basically pretty high, and it will just increase because besides ARM and MIPS and PowerPC, the usual things, there's so many other DSPs or processors which you don't know much about, or you don't have the tool chains, you don't know the assembly for that. And if you start, getting samples like that for an obscure architecture, and you don't know the assembly, then the learning curve for the analyst, and also the time to develop tools which can help analysts is pretty complex. So the platform heterogeneity makes it a bit like one level more complex than the normal PC. And then the malware family plurality, okay, in case of PC, there is high number of families. For the last 30 years, there have been quite some families developed and evolved. And that also gives a pretty good understanding of how the normal PC's malware work, their strategies, their usual attack vectors, exploits they carry, obfuscation techniques, so on and so forth. At the same time, for IoT, yet the malware family plurality is low, so in a way it's a good time to just stop, like take a snapshot and look what is going on there, learn from the PC malware plurality families, and apply the same kind of knowledge but in a better way, so that at least we can avoid the next Mirai or whatever it is. Then from the detection on the system point of view, well, nowadays there's so many complementary or orthogonal defenses on normal PCs and servers. You have network intrusion detection system, host intrusion detection systems, antiviruses, rootkit detectors. So definitely detection in the system is quite easy for the PC one way or another. But for IoT, how do you know, for example, if your thermostat is being infected? Or how do you know that your smart fridge connected to the internet is already infected? So detecting that is not pretty straightforward because, well, the human-machine interfaces are pretty much different, and at the same time, the tools and the antiviruses and things like that, they are not, well, thought to be usable in such systems as they are today. Then in vivo analysis, pretty much for the PC, we have good sandboxes. Every major antivirus company, threat intelligence, have their own sandboxes, or they use open source or closed source ones. And in vivo analysis basically resumes to the fact that you have a bunch of virtual machines running. You get what you need, you analyze it fast. Then for IoT, it's not quite easy because in vivo analysis, well, if you've tried to reflash or reprogram some kind of a router, which is one of the simple examples, then you'd see the pain, how much like pain needs to do that analysis. It's not super complicated these days anymore, but still it's quite painful. And then you multiply it by the platform heterogeneity and the evolution of malware families, and then it becomes pretty hard to do in vivo analysis. Same goes for sandbox execution, and then for removal. Well, for the PCs, well, some of them are easy, some of them not so easy to remove, but then on IoT, you know, it's hard to impossible to remove. How do you, well, of course you can do factory reset your device, but some devices or some malware family for IoTs, they have persistence built in, so even if you reboot it, reset it, factory reboot, they just write themselves into bootloaders or different areas, and they're like really hard or impossible to remove. Never mind for a simple user. At the same time, the vulnerability assessment, of course, for the PC, they carry some kind of exploit or some kind of attack payload, which they use to infect the system, and they are exploiting basically a vulnerability. And analyzing those vulnerabilities are pretty easy because, well, you just have a virtual machine for x86, and you can see the vulnerability easy. But then if it's about IoT device, then you don't have virtual machines for all the routers, like emulating completely the routers for every vendor. You don't have virtual machines which emulate, I don't know, your Google Nest, your Philips Hue light bulb, and it's really hard to first understand. Well, of course, you can extract the payload and exploit from the IoT malware, but then managing to find what vulnerability it exploits, it's a pretty hard thing because you need to have a device or a pretty damn good emulator for that device. And as I said, there are so many devices and so many architectures, but it's not quite straightforward to get an emulator for every kind of device. And then you buy the device, and maybe it's not the same hardware revision, or it's not the same firmware revision, and you cannot find the actual vulnerability it exploits. So this is kind of, you know, summarized. I talked a bit on that. But then going back to the study on and IoT embedded malware, so before I dig into the methodology and what we have collected and what we have found, it's a good maybe time to take a look at this timeline perspective. So we can see that, well, recently there have been so many new malware families for IoT every year. And basically, well, I'm not quite sure if, well, basically, it boils down to that starting from 2014, 2015, there's been an explosion. But even before that, there were some kind of experimental types of IoT malware. Some of them go back to 2005, 2007, basically some kind of DNS changer. So they were using mostly, you know, those kind of unauthenticated CSRF to change DNS settings of particular routers, and then they use, you know, banking, phishing pages, and so on to just get financial gain. But still, they were using already some kind of CSRF DNS changers. Some of the source code dates back to 2001. If you did some malware research back then you probably know Knight and Kiten.c, which are pretty much known tools to start with for malware. But basically the idea is that we have a manageable number of IoT malware, but then the thing is that they are being discovered by independent groups, and they all publish in different places, and they publish in different format, and they still not, well, even though they're malware databases, they are not so well to grasp all the technical details and the types of analysis and so on. So what we did is we said, let's do a malware study, because this set is pretty small yet, is not thousands of families. It's pretty easy, let's say, not completely easy, but it's easy to just sit down and gather all the details, all the indicators of compromise, and all the samples, more or less, and just try to understand what is going on in IoT malware and understand why things like Mirai and Brickerbot still happen to this date, right? I guess everybody know about Mirai and Brickerbot and similar attacks, right? So the malware study, we started with, well, we are doing, let's say, academic research, so we have some methodologies we need or we want to follow, so at least a systematic way how we approach it, so that we can get a uniform view regardless where the report comes from or where the malware comes from. So, of course, these are basically obvious things which are being stated, but we need to identify a complete set of IoT embedded malware families, so we basically did it. It's growing, so maybe in a couple of years it will not be as easy to bootstrap this kind of research again, but at this point it's pretty easy to make the complete family tree. Identify relevant and trusted information sources, of course, threat intelligence, malware analysis, open source intelligence, blog posts, technical reports, and academic papers. But then this is kind of pretty easy. Everybody knows the big player. We know whom to read, and so on. But then collecting all that information, it goes into multiple different directions. It's a bit challenging. So we had to collect samples. We had to collect the blog posts, the analysis, and technical reports, some reports about real-world or honeypot attack, malware family and botnet evolution. Maybe it helps in predicting or seeing how it evolves. But then what we were really interested, or how this study actually started, is we were interested why still the IoT malware can be so successful and so devastating by using very simple, and very old CVEs. Like, that's kind of not going to happen in normal PC world. You need some kinds of more advanced zero-day. But in IoT world, you can just get a pair or two of CVEs from 2014, and you can still be the big botnet. So why it's happening? So we were interested in getting the infection and propagation details, like credentials they use, and more importantly, the vulnerabilities and exploits, and then see, well, the defensive measures, if there were some defensive measures or not, and any other relevant information that might help. Okay, so of course, then the methodology is we need to structure and systematize all that information and metadata, because it's like a huge list of resources, huge list of URLs. Some of them just disappear or go offline. You need to go to archive.org or to caches, get all that information back, reconstruct all the analysis, and so on. And we wanted to do this for several reasons, so that by systematizing that, it's at least one step towards doing machine learning and artificial intelligence for defensive purposes. If you don't have systematic data, everything you throw at machine learning is basically garbage in, garbage out, Gigo effect. So you need some kind of way to systematize, and that's you need to do, at least at this particular stage, you need to do all this manually or semi-manually. And I'll explain you in case studies why sometimes you still need to do manually. You cannot just go and scrape the HTML page. Hint, for example, IOCs are put in PNG pictures. Well, how is that helpful? I'm not quite sure. But then, of course, analyzing the metadata, understanding what and where goes wrong in the defense and in the attacks, so that at least when the next Mirai comes or the next firmware updates are being issued, then it's at least people are, or the industry or the community is at least more ready to do that. Of course, cross-correlate all that information, extract all kinds of statistics you want to extract, because statistics is a funny thing. You can make statistics out of anything. Okay, so in a nutshell, what we did, we were about 60 different or semi-different, let's say, malware families we've identified, or at least tried to isolate our case study to. And we analyzed, like, more or less thoroughly to date, to the date of the data set, around 28 of them, about half of them. And for this analysis, we kind of had to go through around 1,300 resources. That includes URLs, node rules, IOCs, virus total reports. All that counts as a resource that we can use to draw some kind of conclusion or extract some additional metadata about each particular vulnerability or malware. We also analyzed the CVEs that were used or at least reported to have been used in these 60 malware families. And to the date of analysis, at least according to the report we've collected, there were around 120 vulnerabilities, not all of them having CVEs, which is another pain in the back, but we'll come to that later. We analyzed about 80, especially from the point of view if there's any defense or detection rule for that kind of CVE, when it was published, when it was used, and all these timeline measurements. Collect, analyze, review, archive, systematize, machine-readable, JSONs, XMLs, Python code, basically all these pipeline and glue which can help more automated analysis. So for malware families, what we did, we collect, well, it started with few features and then it quickly grew to several dozens of features. But even though they are kind of separate features, some of them are more timeline, like timeline of first seen of a malware, first online submission, meaning when somebody submitted it online for analysis, because sometimes maybe somebody is just having a suspicion or is testing their own exploit and things like that. Analysis reports based on the sample, so we can see how fast or how quickly was the response of the threat intelligence community. Then we also collect the timelines of defenses like IDS, IPS rules, when they were released or published, YARA rules, vulnerability assessment systems, so that at least we know how bad are we lagging behind, with the defenses compared to the exploit and malware bleeding edge. And all this, source availability, if the source available, it means that that kind of malware most likely will be even further developed or improved, and definitely it will be coming back more and more. Of course, some other, they don't have public open source, like public source exposed, but it has, at least in the underground forums, the availability of the source code is more limited, so it doesn't go so much out of hand as Mirai variants, for example. And of course, there's a lot of missing, incorrect, inconsistent, and confusing information, which we need to analyze, spot, correct, and stuff like that. So the idea is that if you feed incorrect information, you think that all information is systematized, but the systematized information contains errors, then your machine learning will learn very bad things because it's just bad information you feed it in as if it was correct. So things like that. For CVEs and vulnerabilities, we collect CVSS scores, of course, and then timelines of discovery, disclosure, technical analysis, exploit availability for each CVE. Why we do that? Well, because we want to see how these CVEs and vulnerabilities evolve and when they are being picked up by IoT malware, and why we cannot defend before that. Okay, so the same is true for missing, incorrect, inconsistent information for CVEs and vulnerabilities and exploits. So, well, let's summarize statistics. If you're really interested about, again, the methodology and things like that, you can check the white paper, which contains all the white paper style kind of thing. But now I want to present some of these findings from the perspective that we are not doing so well in the sense that as a, let's say, defense or as a security community, we are not doing so well in many ways. So, for example, for the analyzed 80 CVEs, or vulnerabilities actually, about 16% they have no CVE or any kind of identifier. So basically, if you want to exchange threat intelligence, or you want to talk, have you seen this malware, it exploits this vulnerability. Which vulnerability? Dealing vulnerability. But the dealing has so many vulnerabilities. Which one? So there's so much confusion by missing CVE identifiers or some other type of identification for a vulnerability. And it's a bit saddening, because it means that something is different or is, I don't know, is not optimized in the CVE assignment or filing process, and people do not file CVEs or they are not being assigned. But Another interesting thing is that for all the analyzed CVEs, you can see the mean and median of the scores for CVSS and version 3 and version 2, and you can see that, let's consider version 3, the mean and median were about 8. They're pretty high, but they're not critical. So most malware don't need 10.0 critical vulnerabilities to be super successful. It's enough to be mediocre. Some of them do very fine with 6.5. So even very low, very simple vulnerabilities are being successfully exploited by IoT malware. And basically, that means that something is broken in the defense part somehow. Okay, then we try to collect also the IDS rules. And if you think that just, that collecting vulnerability information and vulnerabilities IDs is tricky, then try collecting IDS rules and match them to CVs or vulnerabilities, and especially to vulnerabilities which do not have any kind of identification. Try to find an IDS rule for that one. That's kind of not straightforward. And we have found that around, 27 didn't have, from the 80 CVs we analyzed in depth, around 27 do not have any IDS rules. So it means that those vulnerabilities cannot be detected by snort or any kind of intrusion detection. So even if you have a good setup with running IDSs and stuff like that, you don't have the rules for them. So IoT malware will just go through and you'll never notice. And only 53 had. Then what we analyze, we also check the timeline when those rules were released compared to when the vulnerability knowledge was there. So assuming that the vulnerability was released on day 0 or the 1st of January, we count how many days a particular IDS or defense rule to detect that vulnerability was released. And staggering, we find, well, you see the mean is a bit higher, but the median, which is, let's say, normalized in a way, it's still pretty high. It's 184 days, like half a year on average to write a rule to detect a particular CV, which is pretty huge. If you think about that there's a vulnerability and everything is known about it, or at least parts of it, and for some of them exploits is available, it still takes half a year to write a rule to detect it in snort or whatever your preferred IDS is. And half a year is pretty big window of opportunity. Then we also look for vulnerability assessment rules. So let's say you have a system and you're not trying to catch malware, but you are trying to assess your own, proactively you are trying to assess your own system or setup. Then we found that even less number of vulnerabilities have vulnerability assessment rules. So you cannot even use OpenVAS or some other related system to scan your network or scan your systems and know whether you have that vulnerability or not. Only 33 had, at least from all the Googling and all the resources and emerging threats and other sources, only 33 of them have a vulnerability assessment rule. And again, we measure the time when the vulnerability assessment rule was released compared to when the vulnerability was known. And again, there's still some delay, about 2 months or 2 months and a half from the time the vulnerability is released, by the time you can at least check that your system are vulnerable to that vulnerability. Never mind detecting or defending. So still 2 months where you just have no visibility. Then that's kind of the idea with the vulnerabilities and CVs. We see that there's quite some delay in releasing those detection or protection rules. And then we also do similar kind of measurements for timelines for malware families. So we analyze these 28 malware families in depth. In general, most of them have around 3 vulnerabilities or 3 CVEs they actively use. Of course, there are exceptions, and of course, the new versions keep adding more in a more plugin style base. They add new vulnerabilities each day. And of course, the notable exceptions are the BrickerBot, which had a big number of vulnerabilities being exploited. And maybe VPN filter also had a good count, but on average, like the mean and the median are 3 vulnerabilities per family. Of course, it will just be growing up as new families and new vulnerabilities are being incorporated. But what's interesting is that the vulnerability knowledge and the CVE knowledge about the exploited vulnerability, so you have a timeline when the malware was discovered, submitted for analysis, has been spotted in the wild, doesn't matter. You have a day when the malware has been caught exploiting a given vulnerability. What is interesting is that, on average, the data about the exploited vulnerability was there 2 years before. So you had 2 years to patch that vulnerability or to do something about it, and still their malware, after 2 years, being so successful in exploiting it. And that's kind of something to think about. Is this presentation is more about getting the thinking to start, because it shouldn't be like that, but you have 2 years, but a known vulnerability is there, you have some or all technical details, and still nothing is being done by the vendors or by the users or some other systems which can prevent this kind of attacks. Well, then we also try to see if there are any detection rules which are targeting not the vulnerabilities themselves, but target the, or try to detect the malware, like its command and control centers or some probing packets or the brute forcing. So we try to see if there are detection and protection rules specifically tailored to the malware, not to the CVE and vulnerabilities it carries or exploits. And only 17 of them had specific rules for the malware, like maybe 2/3. So 1/3 didn't have any specific rules, so they could have been detected only by having IDS and IPS rules for vulnerabilities. And again, basically, the malware-specific rules were released, like malware-specific detection rules were released, again, almost 3 months after the malware has been analyzed, has been discovered, has been published, and so on and so forth. Why it takes 3 months to publish that kind of rule? I understand there's some complexity in publishing that, and there's embargoes on publishing some information, but this means that there's so many unprotected systems left out there just because there's this huge delay which we don't understand why it's happening. So maybe something about the processes. And but then what we see if we add also the timeline of the vulnerabilities for each malware carries and their IDS rules. So this delay is even bigger. So the idea is that, again, there was 700 days before earliest malware knowledge for a particular vulnerability. So there's 2 years and something, or almost 2 years. We did the same for vulnerability assessment rules, and basically there are not so many vulnerability assessment rules which can detect malware families, but we still did the exercise because it kind of was there and we could do that. It's not relevant. We had just one vulnerability assessment rule which kind of tried to detect some malware family in some way. But, well, that's kind of could be like an outlier, so we don't know too much. Then, if you talk about malware, then there's this YARA rules, which, well, is a good tool to detect all kinds of patterns, and especially to detect malware is pretty widely used. Only 11 or 1/3 of the analyzed malware had public YARA rules available. Of course, there might be some closed source inside the community or the threat intelligence community, but at least publicly available to end users or sysadmins, only 11 YARA rules were available for the 28 we analyzed. And the idea is that what's interesting that those YARA rules were available on average 213 days after earliest malware knowledge. So there's the malware, there's the analysis, there's the discovery of the malware, all the blog posts, all the technical reports. But then there's 230 days which goes by and there's no YARA rule to detect that malware on your system, on your router, whatever, you name it. So that's kind of basically, if there's a sysadmin who is not super security savvy, then more than half a year, well, it's basically lost time, and those malware can come back all the time. And that's one of the reasons maybe why some of these CCTV cameras, if you clean it up, put it back on the internet, there has been an experiment, in less than 5 minutes it will be infected with some kind of new strain of Mirai or something like that. Just because these protection rules are not there and they're also not easy to manage on those devices. Of course, we also want to do some dynamic malware analysis. I'll go a bit faster because we are a bit running out of time, but the idea is that we want to do dynamic analysis, and for this you need some kind of sandbox environment. And as said, for sandbox environment, well, usually it's the virtual machines and things like that, or the device, but the device you can break or is expensive to buy. So everybody in the community uses emulators, but then emulators are a bit trickier for embedded devices, and there's not so much support. But anyway, the sandbox need the emulator in the backend. So we proposed ourselves, to learn more about the malware by running them in the sandbox. And for that, there were not so many choices. There are some alternatives like detax.org, and there is Cuckoo. Maybe some of you know Cuckoo sandbox. But the thing is that by default, it doesn't support like ARM and MIPS and things like that. And then you need to extend it in certain ways so that it can use a QEMU MIPS and QEMU ARM so that you can analyze ARM, MIPS, PowerPC based malware. Some of the challenges in extending the framework are presented. Well, the CPU architecture, the runtime libraries, how you put that together so that the malware runs and doesn't crash in the emulator. Basically, I'll skip that because I've presented the platform heterogeneity. It becomes really hairy and messy when you think about different kinds of architectures that, it's not just x86, but it's MIPS, and then there are two types of releases for MIPS, and you need both emulators for both, and then there's little endian and big endian, and so on and so forth. So there were some different previous attempts to study Linux or IoT-based malware, and there are sandboxes which have some degree of non-x86 support. But there's no out of the box, easy to use support. So our friend Jonas at Talos, he developed this support for Cuckoo Sandbox and uses QEMU in the backend and SystemTap to analyze the execution trace when the malware runs. And then uses a Docker container to quickly bootstrap an analysis sandbox on your analysis computer. You'll get a link where you can get it at the end of the presentation. But I'll just go a bit faster. There are, different challenges that need to be solved. As I said, like system image preparation, you need to have a good operating system which can run that IoT malware. And usually the most common choice is Debian-based, because they already have some precompiled versions of it, or they provide some kernels you can bootstrap from. And then, the analysis process is pretty simple. We triage the samples. The emulator is being prepared by the Cuckoo Sandbox. The sample execution terminates. We get the log files, the system calls, the IP addresses it tries to connect, or DNS probes it tries to send. But of course, it's not like a complete picture, because sometimes those IP addresses are not anymore available because the CC is down and so on. But nevertheless, it gives you an idea about the malware sample. That's a screenshot. Unfortunately, because of the technical things, the presentation running on that computer, so I cannot show a video of this in action. But you can get the source codes from the link at the end. And some case studies. Well, try to be really fast because then it's the prize time, and we don't want to. We have several case studies. There's different malware families which are known for a long time, but then because there's no CV attached to the vulnerability they exploit, we see the same vulnerability basically exploited by Hydra in 2008, and then we see the same exploit vulnerability described in a security advisory in 2013, and still there is no CVE attached to this vulnerability. And then in 2017, we see it used in Reaper, and we see several other advisories which describe pretty much the same or very similar vulnerability, and there's still no CVE map attached to it. So 10 years, the same vulnerability just keeps reappearing, being used in different kinds of malware in Hydra and IoT Reaper, but still there's no CVE to it, and it's not easy to talk about the same vulnerability in common terms. Then, for some of the samples, what we have found is that virus total, so it depends where you are taking your threat intelligence and how much you trust your threat intelligence provider. Some of these samples or some of these different families, they are from different years, from 2014 to 2018. What they have in common is that the first seen in the wild date in virus total is 2010, 11, 20. So you can see that it doesn't make any sense, and sometimes these threat intelligence providers, they rely on some third-party source of information, and that information may not be reliable, and then you need to do something about that. Well, it's not an easy answer how to do that, but the idea is that you have to trust but verify even the metadata you get from really trusted sources, because, well, that's life. So you see that this first seen in the wild, 2010, it doesn't make any sense for GoScan and SSH and Genix, Jennifer malware, which is from 2018. Well, conclusion, not all metadata is created equal, need to trust your metadata vendor, and you need to continuously check, reassess, and clear your metadata if you want to plan to put it into machine learning and artificial intelligence. Well, then we have a lot of cases when the reports are just mentioning it uses a delink exploit, and then you have to go figure out and spend countless hours to actually find the vulnerability number and find the detection rule and protection rule for that vulnerability. And this is like not an easy task even for a seasoned analyst, never mind for automated machine learning system that to just go and grab everything from internet and will be able to learn. So there are a couple of examples. I'll just skip through them, but trust me, there are so many examples where the report just describes the vulnerability but doesn't give a number to it or a link to the vulnerability itself. Okay, then there's wrong CVE numbers or wrong exploits, and you see clearly that's kind of a human error where two numbers are interchanged, and basically they relate to different vulnerabilities. So the one in the detection rule is not the one which is being actually exploited, and that's kind of poses other types of problems. So you'll see in your logs that somebody is trying to exploit picture engine on your router, which doesn't have any picture engine. So it doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I'll have to skip through the slides because we're pretty close to the end, but I want to come to the conclusion mainly. There are many case studies. We can go through the whole day about what can go wrong in collecting and systematizing that kind of data. But the key takeaways, well, first, in my view, in our view, is that to understand IoT malware, well, we definitely need to take a wider view, and it's necessary and beneficial at the same time. Wider view meaning that we don't just need to look at bits and bytes of the malware itself and just try to run it, but we also need to look at the bigger picture. Why that malware and attacks happen, whether there were any defenses, like looking at the metadata, timelines help very much, understanding why it takes so long to have a defense or a protection rule and things like that. So archive all the things, security advisories, all the exploits, so that it's at least easier to start digging later on the details. So definitely a lot of metadata helps. Then to improve the security posture of IoT and embedded, we think that proper vulnerability management, disclosure, and defense is needed, but that's kind of an obvious thing everybody keeps saying for the last 10 years or more. that everybody needs to do proper vulnerability management disclosure, but we still see that there are so many vulnerabilities without a CVE, and there's lacking essential technical details, which make them really hard to use. But then maybe one idea to improve that is, when people are releasing vulnerability details and exploits, the part of full or responsible disclosures should include maybe some kind of defense as well, not just the exploit to exploit the thing, like the offensive part, but maybe also propose the defense rule, at least, the simplest one, somebody that can take that rule and improve it later, but at least with the vulnerability details, you get also the defense rules, not just the offensive rules, which makes the life of attacker easier, but makes life of defenders so much harder. Maybe having bug bounties for defense, instead of just finding the exploits and zero-day, trying to actually have those kind of hackathons or bug bounties where people would develop Yara rules, IDS, snort kind of rules to protect and detect certain exploits. So therefore, at least the defensive database will be at least as good as the CVE and exploitation and vulnerability database. So that could be a thing. Maybe security data cleanup day. Everybody goes and cleans up some entries in the CVE, in exploit.db, in emerging threats, things like that. It's a community effort, but it's kind of ideas. Maybe somebody wants to champion some of them. Then, of course, to enable AI-powered cybersecurity, everybody dreams about that, AI-powered and machine learning-based cybersecurity, like a super smart system which will do everything, but we need proper, clean, structure, updated data, absolutely we need that. And otherwise, we just get this Gigo effect, garbage in, garbage out, right? So the effectiveness of a data mining exercise depends critically on the quality of the data. In computing, this idea is expressed in the familiar acronym GIGO, and this is an excerpt from a very well-respected book. So we cannot have like a good AI-powered cyber system if our data to start with is really bad. Finally, the takeaways for IoT malware. IoT malware works well with all the days. They don't need 0 days. They, of course, welcome it, but they don't need to burn any 0 days to actually be super successful. And we have seen that they are doing pretty fine, and some of these are because the defenses come so much later than the vulnerability information. That could be one of the reasons why they are doing so well with all days. And of course, we need more and better automated tools for IoT malware's analysis. Of course, taking Cuckoo Sandbox and similar one step further, adding a new architecture to QEMU and adding a new architecture to Cuckoo Sandbox definitely help. And of course, maybe having, there are of course standards to exchange security information and IoT malware information and threat intelligence, but we need to do maybe this in a better way. So thank you so much for being patient, and sorry for the technical hiccups. I hope you had a very good DefCamp. Thanks to the organizers, and thank you for being such a great audience. Thanks. Any questions?
Hi, okay, we have a question here coming to you. No?
Oh, there are several, but... Oh.
Hello.
Okay.
First of all, thank you for your presentation. And is there any strong way of preventing this kind of attacks?
Well, basically there's no, I cannot say strong ways. It's basically a community effort, like a community and industry effort in all the directions. It's the vendors who need to actually develop those devices, you know, as if they were developing critical things, and take a more proactive and better security-oriented posture, responding properly, filing CV numbers, releasing those firmware updates in time, you know, and actually educating the users about security. And we see this kind of helps already with randomized non-default username and passwords. That's one direction, but there are so many other types of vulnerabilities these devices have. So this is one way, so educating the user understanding the risks, vendors, also the community. So there's no one thing which can just, you know, strong ways. But one step at a time, I think if we do it should be good.
As a user, is there anything I can do to protect myself as a user against a zero-day attack while using IoT devices if the vendor does not provide a fix for the attack?
Yeah, well, definitely you can have some countermeasures, and as I mentioned, some of those countermeasures are using some of those available intrusion detection systems. Of course, they are not perfect, and as more and more things go on HTTPS, that's becoming even more tricky, right? So, but at least having some kind of intrusion detection system and running those rules definitely help. If you have a console to your devices, of course, running some YARA rules to see that those payloads are detected, because in many devices you can still get a telnet or SSH type of thing. And if the devices would have been more open or more user-friendly, so to speak, or sysadmin-friendly, then you could have maybe a very simple YARA engine running on those devices, at least for your own personal purposes, and keep scanning them, you know, with a cron daemon, and you'd get some hit, hit if something just drops on your embedded device. So that's something definitely, but it's not an easy task, because then some of those devices miss the telnet and SSH, or you need to do very complex system administration voodoo to make it work, right?
2 more questions. Okay, we have one over there.
Hello. Continuing the idea, to use a personal VPN, like on your own router, can be more secure to use the IoT devices at home?
Well, from my perspective, or from my understanding, running VPN on your router or connecting your router through the VPN doesn't, you know, mitigate existence of the exploit of vulnerabilities in the router or on your devices on your network. So maybe it will make it a bit harder to access your device or the devices behind your router, but it will not make those vulnerabilities go away, and also will not detect them, right? It's just, you know, making your traffic more secure, but whatever goes over the traffic, it's still the same old exploit. So I don't think so that it's the solution in general, like to this kind of vulnerability-based exploitation and malware.
It's not the extra layer of security.
Yeah, of course. That's an extra layer, definitely. But I don't think that's enough.
Okay, on to the last question. We had one there in the back. If you could pass the mic.
My question is, how much time do you spend trying to find them? And when do you think it's time to stop and continue moving on to another malware?
What do you mean to stop collecting what exactly?
If you found the malware on any IoT device, when do you think it's time to move on to try to research another one? When do you stop? When do you say, I know everything about this, I don't need anything else?
There's always, like, all the malware families we analyze, they definitely do not completely gives us all the information. There are bits and pieces missing in all of these families. Either missing CVE number, or either missing intrusion detection rule, or some specific details in the technical analysis. They're like not complete set of information. It's all the time new information is welcome, and we need to augment it with new information. For the purpose of this study, we actually limited ourselves to what was known back when we started, like 60 malware families. Of course, we keep adding new ones, but as in malware, it's like a never-ending story. Like new things will come up, and of course, you need to at least start with some good methodology and some good data, and then at least whatever comes next at least goes directly into your established framework, and it's much easier to, you use the same measurement and the same features and the same metrics. At least, you have a bootstrap database, and then adding one more is a less of an effort than starting over again. But it's a never-ending process. Well,
okay, that's about it.
Thank you
so much,
much.
Andrei.
Thank you.